Attention, please. Thank you all for coming to this event, Frontiers in Climate Resilience and Security, that we are hosting here today. I'm really happy that we are able to host this important and interesting seminar on a very important subject. And we're doing it jointly with the CPRI and with the Resilience Center. And and we have filled this beautiful room to all seats, I think. We hear first the foreign minister deliver a speech on the topic, and we then, after that, will move into a very prominent panel. I will introduce them later, but we have also our Minister for Development Cooperation here today, so it's a very high-level discussion today, and I hope that we'll provoke some good discussion and that we will all learn from this experience. But Margot, please, I invite you to take the microphone here.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I am delighted to see all of you here today, and I want to say a warm welcome to all of you. We see so many embassies represented, and that's fantastic, but also I would say academia and so many other partners in the work on this issue. So I'm impressed by the interest that has been shown to this event. Happy to be here together with Isabella, and of course she has the deepest knowledge also about the situation when it comes to the whole issue of climate change. And what I would like to talk about has to do with how this also represents a threat to peace and security. Again, a warm welcome to all of you, and I'm looking forward to the discussions here. I don't need to say the obvious to all of you here. Climate change is one of the greatest threats to global security, because global change knows no borders and presents also an existential challenge to us all. An important security effect of climate change is an increase in the frequency of extreme weather events, floods and storms principally, and this affects the infrastructures of towns and cities. It affects access to drinking water and other resources to support daily life. It also drives the displacement of populations, and since 2008, an average of 26.4 million people per year have been displaced from their homes by disasters brought on by natural hazards. 85% of these were weather-related, and this is equivalent to approximately one person displaced every second. And you know what comes next. At the end of this comes, of course, conflicts over land and natural resources, and it creates social unrest, and this in turn drives also security problems, and with the risk of conflicts and, in the end, wars. And this is one example of why it is so important that we meet here today and speak on this crucial topic. I want to say something about why we see climate change as a matter of international peace and security, and as such, why we believe that this should be on the table of the Security Council. And let me also now start by using this opportunity to thank Stockholm Resilience Center and CPRI for co-organizing this seminar. The scale of climate challenges that we face today and in the future are now evident. The adverse effects of climate change have the potential to undermine the development gains of over the last many decades, and they threaten the prospects for achieving Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Talking about the development goals quickly turns into long-term challenges. And this is no future development. It is a reality of the present. It is livelihoods and food security being threatened due to these changing weather patterns, making people more vulnerable to recruitment by terrorist groups as well. It is a young girl now forced to walk even further to collect water for her family, missing school and being more exposed to sexual violence. It is crop being lost and famine spreading, resulting in forced migration that causes human suffering, tensions between people. It is changing water flows in some of the largest rivers, affecting the water supply for millions of people and increasing competition over already scarce resources. And I think it starts and ends in a way also. And I would like to say in Oslo, also about climate change. And I remember this speaker who said that maybe we shouldn't leave it to the naturalists, to the natural scientists to discuss this whole matter. It is really more about the behavioral scientists that ought to discuss why is it that we cannot effectively enough respond to those threats. And she explained it, that it's because we see it as something, we cannot see it as an enemy that we are going to and to somebody else. And instead we need to start to look at it as something that is happening now, affecting all of us in our neighborhood. And of course the extreme weather events we can already notice everywhere in the world. But this may be a tips to all of us how we organize some of these debates. Maybe we should also have contributing to insecurity and conflict. And the conflicts and the droughts amplify each other and have resulted in famines at a scale not seen in many years. Rising sea levels are threatening the very existence of people and countries, not least the Pacific Island states. So, friends, the relationship between climate change and security is complex. Melting glaciers, floods in coastal areas, hurricanes, drought, and desertification as a consequence of climate change is increasingly affecting all of us and can trigger unrest and exacerbate already existing social tensions. Climate-related resource scarcity, such as lack of water or food, combined with inequality and shifting demographics, also provide fertile grounds for conflict. The countries most affected are those already vulnerable, ridden by conflict and severe poverty, where governance is weak and institutional capacity to deal with shocks and crises is low. Let me in this context also emphasize the critical importance of applying a gender perspective. Women are often among those hardest hit, but also critical agents of positive change. And think of the fact that women are often also those who first see the change in crop seasons, or where there is starting to be a lack of access to drinking water and all of these phenomena. One thing is clear. In order for the international community to make informed decisions when it comes to preventing conflict and preserving peace, we need better understanding of these links and improved assessments of the risks already at play. And let me share with you another specific example. A couple of weeks ago, I visited Bangladesh, and the main purpose was to look into the situation for the hundreds of thousands of people who have fled from Myanmar. But the visit also reminded me of the fact that Bangladesh is one of the most exposed countries to climate change due to geographic and demographic reasons. And Bangladesh is a country where extreme poverty is still prevalent and where 1/3 of the country is projected to be underwater within only a few years. And it was a paradox, or a bit absurd, because there were also flying over Bangladesh, and where we landed, we could see the white beaches of Cox's Bazar, where they are hoping that they could have actually more tourism. A few kilometers from there, a whole new country, a whole new city has grown up, shacks built by the refugees, very, very difficult circumstances, very hilly, and also at the bottom of these valleys, people have built their makeshift small houses. And on the next hill, the remaining forests, now being cut down piece by piece or part by part, and a risk also for the deforestation in this area. So it was kind of concentrated in this small area, all the effects of both climate change, I would say, and an environmental problem combined with the social tensions that come from migration. And around 500,000 people per year are estimated to migrate internally, climate change being one of the main reasons. And the influx of refugees from Myanmar over the last months have put additional pressure on this already exposed environment. I have no doubt that the international community needs better assessments of this and similar situations in order to respond as effectively as possible, taking into account all factors that are at play. So what could this lead to if it continues unhindered like this? Dear friends, mitigating climate change and its negative security consequences is a key priority for the Swedish government, including during our term in the Security Council. And this is what I want to end with. Improved governance and increased attention to climate-related security risks is urgently needed. And there is no doubt that the United Nations should take a leading role in this regard, and we have been very clear on this. However, there is currently an institutional gap in the UN system when it comes to addressing the risks of instability, insecurity, and conflict arising from the interaction of climate change and social, economic, and political factors. This must change. For the UN to be truly fit for purpose, with conflict prevention at the core of its efforts, the UN needs to have the capacity to manage climate-related security risks. It is, as such, a matter of UN reform to successfully build a stronger United Nations that delivers sustainable development and peace for the future. Reform efforts must take a climate-changed world into account. Descriptive consequences of climate change will inevitably end up, disruptive consequences of climate change will end up on the table of the Security Council and the Secretary for these issues, and I think we have already placed it there, and now it can't go away. I think we can only develop the way we do it so that we see that it is helpful, because we can do much more of conflict prevention that way.
Thank you so much. I will ask you to sit down, and we have our expert panel that I would like to bring now to the table. First, of course, our Minister for Development, Cooperation and Climate, Isabella Lövin. And we have Johan Rockström, who is the Director for the Stockholm Resilience Center. And we have Dan Smith, who is the Director of CIPRI. Welcome to the table. Now, my suggestion is actually in order for you to be seen and heard properly, that you walk up to the podium and have your brief intervention. We'll take it in a row, so the three of you, and then we'll have some questions. I have some already that I've thought through, but we will pick up something also from the audience. So Isabella, can I please ask you to begin?
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. It's great that the interest for this debate and this topic is so great. And I think this is only the beginning, where we see how this issue links so closely to global security. But what we see, I think, in general, to start off let's say, the new era for the world was the Agenda 2030 and 2015 with the Paris Agreement and the financing for development, where we all saw that all these issues are so interlinked. We actually cannot talk about climate change separately from economic development or food security or ocean sustainability. And we cannot talk about security or political stability or economic development without taking into account the threats of climate change and the environmental threats that are so imminent to our planet today. We're facing a large population increase in the world, and the pressure on our ecosystems is already too high, and we see that very, very clearly. What we need to do now is to really realize that this threat is a common threat to us all. And I think in the political sphere or in foreign policy or in security, we're very used to thinking about military threats or political threats only. But of course, it's very, very clear that climate change is changing also the physical geography of the world. Things are changing for real. And I just returned from Mali yesterday. I was there for a field trip looking at Swedish Development Cooperation. Also meeting with our troops there. We're part of the MINUSMA, as you know. And climate change is already very, very clearly linked to the security situation in Mali. Last year, or this year rather, the rainy season decreased by 1 month. So instead of 4 months, it's 3 months. And what does that mean? That means that the pastoralists or the people that have their livestock, they usually move from the north to the south. Now they stay in the south for 1 month longer. And that means that the livestock is now destroying the land for the farmers. And in a country with already heightened tension, very many weapons that have come into the country during the conflict, this really constitutes a real threat to security here and now already. And add to that what's happening all over the world with rising sea levels. We have entire countries in the Pacific that are threatened by sea level rise. Kiribati, for instance, is now really planning for their entire population to evacuate these islands. Fiji has provided land for the inhabitants of Kiribati to move there. This is happening here and now. It's already been planned for. And as Foreign Minister Wallström already mentioned, like Bangladesh, the most densely populated country in the world, 1/3 of the country is going to be submerged because of sea level rise. We have the bleaching of coral reefs, which are the nurseries of fish that are now being destroyed by the acidity because of climate change, because the CO2 is absorbed in our ocean. And this really changes the whole biochemistry of the ocean and the conditions for life for fish, which in turn, of course, provides livelihood for millions, hundreds of millions of fishermen, not least small-scale fishermen all over the world. So this is changing power structures and possibilities of livelihoods for people. And we need to take that into account when planning for security, and the security that we absolutely need and is a global good, I would say, because we can't isolate any country and say that that's their problem with a conflict, because conflicts spread globally. We know that through migration, but also through illegal activities, smuggling, trafficking, whatever comes in the footsteps of conflict. So I would say that what we're doing with our development cooperation now is really working a lot on adaptation, on climate change. We're working a lot also on mitigation. Sweden is, in fact, the largest contributor per capita to the Green Climate Fund, also to the Adaptation Fund, to the Green Environmental, Global Environmental Facility, and other such funds. And we're also integrating climate change, adaptation, and mitigation into more and more of our bilateral development cooperation strategies with different countries. And to finish, I mean, it's a threat, we know, but it's also, I would say, the transition that we see, also that we need to do to a zero-carbon, fossil-free economy in the world. It also constitutes a possibility. It's this we have to also bear in mind and see as, in fact, the only possibility that we have to really live in peace, not only with each other, but also with the planet. And I see so many new possibilities with new smart, climate-smart technologies, not least for the poorest countries. And one example that I saw in Mali that really struck me on how things can actually change. Things have been the same for so long, but then all of a sudden this problem comes along, climate change, and through Swedish Development Corporation we're supporting women in growing vegetables and also cultivating honey through keeping bees, instead of what they used to do, which was cutting down the woods to sell the wood for fuel. So this is a project that has been going on for quite some years now, and it's very, very successful, and it's been replicated, and the forest is actually regrowing now. It's fantastic to see, and the bees they contribute to not only to producing honey and giving money to these women, but also pollinating the forest. So it's really getting this ecosystem working again. However, so talking about new opportunities, and the question I asked was, how do you sell the honey? Because this was really out in the very remote area, and how do you get to the market? Well, market, no, we sell it on the Facebook. So this shows that we have new technologies, renewable energy, the digitalization that really provides new possibilities on communication, on doing things differently, and we must take this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy there's hope, and both these interventions have shown that we can do things. Johan, could you give us your perspective on this?
Thank you so much, and I will actually not add anything on scientific diagnostic. It's enough for me to start by saying that Ministers Margot Wallström and Isabella Lövin, their statements have full scientific support. This is the state of the art of science. Science today is forcing humanity for the first time ever in our existence on this little planet to pose the following question. We are actually in the power of destabilizing the whole Earth system. How can we stay within a safe operating space to allow ourselves to stand a good chance of delivering the World 2.0, the Sustainable Development Goals, a prosperous future for humanity? And if we do not stay within that safe operating space, if we do allow ourselves to continue destabilizing, I can tell you that if there's anything that science is, really surprised by, is the speed by which already 1 degree Celsius warming on planet Earth is impacting on social societies, dynamics across the world. So if anything, things are moving faster even than predicted in science. Now, you've probably followed what happened during the last couple of months. The latest assessment shows that 2017 is a depressive year. It's a year when we will be increasing the global emission of greenhouse gases back to the old pace of 2% of increase this year. Now that is actually very surprising and not to say very depressing, because we had 2014, 2015, 2016, which were very positive trend lines toward bending the global curve of emissions. This was seen as potentially the decoupling and the first steps towards Isabella Levine's marker that we need to actually decarbonize the world economy by 2050 to stand a 66% chance of staying under 2 degrees Celsius, which is a point where we haven't been for the past 3 million years. So 2017 is a depressing year. But it's even more depressing because you see 2014, 2015, 2016 was a years when we did not increase emissions. But what happened with climate change? Well, actually, global warming increased faster than ever. ppm levels in the atmosphere popped up from the normal 2 ppm per year, which has been increasing for the past 30 years, to 3.5 ppm. That is not something we want to see, of course, because when humanity is not causing the forcing, why on earth is the planet becoming even more sensitive and unbalanced? Well, we know the answer. It is because of water. It is the extreme El Niño events of 2015, 2016 causing droughts and floods, which means that nature is not operating as it should. So we get less biomass, less forest, more extreme events, causing a resilience loss in the whole planetary system, which means that suddenly it's not only humans causing climate change, it's even nature causing climate change. You may have seen the seminal study by Woods Hole Institute just 1 month back showing that the rainforests on planet Earth have tipped over from being a net sink to now being a net source of carbon dioxide. These are the kind of tipping elements we do not want to see. We need all the biomes on planet Earth to be resilient and strong, not to take care of the planet. She doesn't care all that much about us. It's to really secure humanity's future. So there is a very strong argument why we have to work together and invest in resilience building for our future on planet Earth. But there's good news here, because we have so much evidence today showing that if we invest in resilience building, the capacity to deal with stress and disturbance while continuing to develop, means that we have a win-win opportunity. Because the more we invest in resilience, which the red thread is, in general, to invest in diversity and redundancy, everything from financial systems all the way to biodiversity and ecosystems, means more carbon sequestration, means less methane loss, means better capacity to deal also with climate change. So you invest in resilience, you tick off security, you tick off social development, and you tick off mitigation and capacity for the planet to remain stable. So investing in this win-win can actually both give Earth resilience and give security at the same time. So we have truly an enormous challenge in front of us, but also an enormous opportunity, as Isabella pointed out. And we have so many of the solutions at hand. In fact, for example, we know that we can feed humanity within the current area of agricultural land if we invest in sustainable intensification, which has all to do with water, land, and biodiversity, and recycling nutrients in pathways that can actually carbon sequester and give better livelihoods. So this means that we have an agenda combining climate, security, and resilience. And it is exactly as Margot points out, but we need an institutional home for this. We need to invest in networks of science. We need new science on risk assessment. I don't understand why we tend to always focus on averages all the time. You know, we're kind of on average heading towards 2 degrees Celsius. Well, dear friends, I can tell you that even the IPCC AR5, the minimum denominator of conservative assessment in IPCC, shows that even at current concentration of greenhouse gases, it's a 1.6% risk of attaining 6 degrees Celsius. Well, 1.6% probability of a disaster is like accepting 100,000 fatal air accidents every day. You know, these are kind of risks we're not willing to accept in any circumstance other than for some reason planet Earth. Now, I'm so inspired by Margot and this idea of a research network. We have the World in 2050. For the first time, science is stepping up to explore successful pathways to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals within a sustainable and resilient Earth system. Perhaps we can tap on this network. It's 50+ institutions around the world really gathering forces together with Sustainable Development Solutions Network of the United Nations to serve humanity with innovation and transformation pathways for equitable, just and safe futures within a safe operating space for the SDGs. And finally, who knows, this network should perhaps be, for the first time, supported by a scientific panel on global and human security. Perhaps we need to have that science assessment, a kind of an IPCC equivalent that really takes a stab at this continued debate, because I think we all feel that, oh yes, perhaps climate change has been associated with the Arab Spring and with Syria and Sudan and Mali, but there's always this debate, you know, about the uncertainty. Well, shouldn't we just try to get it straight once and for all and really come to the conclusion, which we all, I think, are convinced of: uncertainty can never be the cause for inaction. It should actually be the reverse. The more uncertain and the higher the risks are, the more we should invest in precautionary, real action forward. So I think there's a lot to do here, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan, and I'll move directly to Dan Smith from CIPRI. And this also shows that this is not only natural science, but also other science that is involved.
Thank you very much, Pelle, and thank you everybody for attending. I think this is a very important event. It's been a pleasure to be working with the Resilience Centre and with the MFA to set this up, and I think that the attendance here shows how important it is, what an appetite there is for it. Let me start with the groundwork that has been laid out and summarize it in a sentence, just in case any of you haven't noticed, or any of our online audience. Climate change is changing the world. Let's not get further into a discussion about that. For the UN, therefore, to be fit for purpose, the expression that Margot used earlier on, in the world today, is to ask for it to be fit for purpose in a climate-changed world. And I think that that means looking at numerous aspects of how the UN operates, how the agencies operate, how the departments operate. And one part of that, not the only part, but not the least important part, is how it operates in the security dimensions and the space of peace and security, which is at the core of the purpose and history of the United Nations. So we have a little look then at the kind of effects that unfolding climate change has. It's exerting pressure on communities, on societies. It exerts pressure through the effect of slow onset changes, like droughts being longer, monsoons, the dates shift, the monsoon becomes more intense. Through sudden shocks, which everybody is commenting on now, the increasing incidence and ferocity of extreme weather events, and just through change, just through glaciers melting. That, at the moment, in some communities is providing more water. It's kind of a golden age, but that golden age will go as the glaciers disappear, and then there will be water shortages. Those pressures on communities and on societies lead to impact on the social patterns, on the way that groups relate to each other. It's through that mechanism, then, that there is an effect on social stability and potentially on political stability. And what do people do in the face of that? Well, they adapt. Of course, everybody adapts. If change comes upon you and on your circumstances and they get less stable, you adapt. You move, you change what you're doing, and if those don't work, perhaps you find yourself fighting. And it's at that end of the range of adaptation that I think we start to concentrate, thinking about what's needed. Adaptation can be bad as well as good. It's often used in the climate world as if adaptation is a good, but adaptation can go horribly wrong. Right? As, for example, herders who change the patterns of their movement of animals, and it has big social effects on themselves and on communities around them. It's that difficulty in getting adaptation right that leads to the risks of insecurity, instability, conflict, and potentially violent conflict. And it's that risk that we have to assess. It's those risks we have to understand in order to be able to act upon them, both preventively, but also for early response. Too often in the diplomatic community, when talking about conflict prevention, there's discussion about early response, and people are actually talking about 3-month or 6-month cycles. And that's not nearly enough to be heading off a major conflict. One needs to be seeing and understanding these things 2-3 years before the potential explosion point, and finding out how to divert the energies, to find different solutions, to bring people together, to talk and ease their way out of the problems. Long-range prevention, which gets written into development strategies, that's talking about 5 to 10 year or longer cycles of action. I want to therefore say that what Margot was talking about, the institutional home in the UN, I think is a fundamental necessity. As you said, these issues are going to land on somebody's table, and they can either land there in a prepared way so that they can be responded to with some kind of good order and confidence about impact and effectiveness, or they can be responded to in a chaotic way and with desperate measures being taken. But these issues are going to be there. They are there already, and they will increasingly be there. Now, I just want to take a step back for a second to think about how to craft that response. And a lot has been said already, so I'm just adding to that. Climate and sustainability issues are obviously natural issues. They're about changes happening in nature. They are social issues. They're about changes happening in society. They are governance issues because they are social issues, because it's a question of how to manage and organize responses. And they're also human issues. And human not only in their impact, but in another dimension as well, which I want to touch on briefly and then close. The way we understand the world, individually and institutionally, cognition is essentially based on familiarity. We cannot, literally, we cannot see and perceive everything around us. Your brain is a fantastic mechanism which is pre-editing everything that you see, that you read, that you understand, that you care about, and it's pre-editing it on the basis of experience. So familiarity is a crucial part of the way in which we understand the world. But if the future is going to be different from the past, because climate change is changing the world, then familiarity won't do. We need fresh thinking. We need innovation. But because familiarity is so important, the change needs to be as light and as much in the grain of what we're doing as possible. So creating a small institutional home in the UN that takes knowledge which already exists in the field and builds on it, packages it, and presents it in a way that diplomats and decision makers can absorb and act upon, that seems to be a light, manageable change that could have a very big impact. I really look forward to the discussion of this in the time to come. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And I think all of you, even if we are talking about the severity of the situation, there were always some proposal on how to move forward, something positive, something to take with us. And that's hopeful for myself, but especially for my children that will be affected by this more than I. I would like to ask you first, Isabella. You mentioned some examples of development cooperation, but what really is Sweden doing here? Are we doing something different than the others? What can we do with our development cooperation, especially?
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, we're really increasing and being leaders in our donations or our support with different climate funds, multilateral work, and we're also introducing a lot more emphasis on climate change measures in our development cooperation. Also helping really, because this is a key point, that all countries in the world has committed to their national determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, and we're also taking that as a starting point for our development cooperation, that we should support countries in their implementation. Also support countries in accessing the different financing mechanisms, which is like the Green Climate Fund, etc. One other area where we're really active is on financing from the different development banks, such as the World Bank or African Development Bank, to push to change the policies on energy investments, on other types of investments as well, that we should go away from fossil fuel investments, go to the sustainable investments that the world needs, because we're talking about otherwise stranded assets. If we're going to stay within the 2-degree target, then we should not continue on searching for more fossil fuels, but the development cooperation resources, the money should go to the future, to that what is really sustainable for the future, and that's what we're pushing for as well. And I think on a policy level, we're also working with expertise, support, there's different fora to do that, direct support through our energy ministry and through Sustainable Energy for All and others. But the important thing is, I think, is to link this to development. It's not about the climate change is not something that is apart from sustainable development. It's the core of this, and this is the only way that we really can have long-term impact that is really positive.
Thank you so much. And I know that you have to depart fairly soon for another meeting. So do we have time for? No. Okay. Then I think big applause to you, and thanks for participating here.
Thank you very much.
But we will continue here. Johan, I listen very carefully to your intervention. Of course, you couldn't avoid talking about the science, but you promised not to. But it is important, isn't it? And you mentioned in the end that you had some idea of bringing some scientific knowledge to really concretely go down to the situation, because there are these anecdotes about how climate is actually creating conflict. Could you expand a little bit on that, because it's interesting. Is there really a connection? Can you see directly through science climate change leading to conflict? I know that there is a debate about that, if it's direct links or if it's sort of indirect links.
No, this is a very important question, of course, and I think it's good for all of us to start in the other end as a beginning point, to state what are we absolutely certain about. And one thing that we're absolutely certain about is that we can no longer decouple extreme weather events. We can no longer decouple droughts and floods. We can no longer decouple massive scale, unexpected disease patterns and heat waves from anthropogenic climate change. So one thing is for certain: we have injected so much energy and heated up the planet so much that we can no longer say that California, that is now having its worst forest fire ever recorded with purple alert, which it has never ever set up ever before. Of course it's a natural event, but we can say with certainty, with zero uncertainty, that human-induced climate change has reinforced this extreme event. That the El Niño 2015-2016 was reinforced by anthropogenic climate change. So that is at the domain of certainty. The uncertainty, which is of course obvious there, is that once you get an unprecedented drought, sudden increase in food prices, volatility on speculation on food markets, combined with social instability, with dictatorships and youth rising, which in the end topples over into the Arab Spring, what role has climate change played in that process? That is where you enter the domain of both scientific and political debate. I would argue today that there is enough evidence to say even here that we cannot decouple global environmental change from these kind of abrupt social occurrences, from the Syrian war all the way to the Arab Spring, but we can never say that climate change is a prime driver. And we can never put our fingers, and we'll probably never be able to put the exact finger on attribution between a drought and social collapse or refugee crisis. That's why I think there is a need for investing in more interdisciplinary science. I think Dan has an important point here of adding in also psychology, humanities, and the social sciences deeply into this. And I think the time is ripe for a scientific panel to kind of scan off the state of knowledge and have a credible assessment and serve that to the political leadership in the world to say, here's the IPCC kind of bottom line state of knowledge when it comes to the connections between anthropogenic climate change, unsecurity, and human impacts. So I think that's, in a way, the state of knowledge. But I think just to close to say that, please remember, and that's a plea, and I think as a natural scientist we have failed here, it's so healthy to focus on risk. I think Margot's point that risk is the entry point to communicate because we understand risk, business understands risks, and remember, risk is equal to probability multiplied by impact. So even if probability and uncertainty is very high, probability is very low, there's a very low probability that the entire Amazon rainforest disappears or we get a drought that simply destroys all crops. But if the impact is very high, then risk is high, and you don't want high risk. So you invest and you deal with security. So I think there's something to learn. I mean, we as natural scientists, something to learn in this whole venture.
Very, very interesting. Dan, you brought up this, you expanded on the institutional mechanism here, and I know that you visited New York, and I'll use the risk allegory here. What is the risk that the UN does not understand that they need to do this?
High. Yes, yeah. The risk is very high because the probability is reasonably high and the impact would be particularly high. I mean, if there is inaction within the UN over this kind of issue, then the UN is significantly hampered in doing the tasks that we want from it in the world as climate change unfolds. And of course, you know, there are a number of different issues at play, and we know about these. I mean, there are turf issues at one level, and there are the way that different governments, including very influential ones, interpret the question of climate change, and, you know, as we know, notoriously, whether or not it is real or simply a Chinese con trick. And all of these things play into the discussions which are being had. And that's why, you know, I agree a lot with the statements that are made that this is not politics, this is science. The world is changing. That is a scientific statement to be making. I agree a lot also with the points that Johan was just making, that the academic community has not been completely able to produce certainty or proof about the causal connection between climate change and violent conflict. I think that a large part of that is because it has been asking the wrong questions, or a lot of scholarly research has been asking the wrong question, and it has been looking at cause based on, or proving cause based on statistics. I think you can prove risk based on statistics, and for me, risk is enough to act. I think also that, as a World Bank study put it a couple of years ago, there's a plausible link between events like the drought in China and the Arab Spring and its kick-off point as far as Egypt was concerned. There's a plausible narrative about that. There isn't hard evidential proof beyond any shadow of a doubt, but there's a plausible narrative. And there's a plausible link in another case, and in another case, and in another case. And at a certain point, these plausibilities pile up, and you say, well, we pretty much better do something about it. At this point, science transfers back into politics again. And that's where you get the hard work that I see Swedish representation in New York, but not just in New York, and other missions in New York also putting in to try to get this case across and get this institutional home initiated so the UN starts to develop in that right direction.
Thank you so much. I think that was very interesting answers. Now we have some time to ask you questions from the floor. Yes.
For science to translate into social movements, there is a need for narratives. I very much liked how the foreign minister used Rolf Edberg's beautiful water poem. At Karolinska Institutet, I'm sorry to say that the knowledge about 2030 agenda and the SDGs is quite low. The Vice Chancellor wants to rectify this. But we need narratives. We need narratives for schools also. And even if the science and the evidence base now is robust, it needs to be translated to move the mountain. Thank you. Where is this process?
I think we'll take a couple of questions and put them together. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I'm Laura Faxas, the ambassador of the Dominican Republic. I'm coming from a little country. I would like to know, you said that it's not a scientific position, but it's a political issue, because today we have a group of scientifics that say the climate change is not important, it's secondary. And then in this case, I think we have to take that a real, a scientific, but a political issue, and debate that on the executive and the United Nations like a political issue too. And that is very, very important to implicate the little country in that debate, because we are suffering that. And in Caribbean region, we are speaking about climate, urgency climate, not climate change, urgency climate. And I would like to know what is the position of Sweden government, and if you like scientific, about the debate in UNESCO of ethical dimension of climate change, that we are introducing a declaration in the 39 conference, general conference, about the ethical dimension of climate change. It's not a problem, a scientific problem, just a scientific problem. It's a real impact in the people. And the big countries are confronted at the ethical dimension of their politics. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Two very pertinent questions. I wonder if the first one, Margot, may I actually direct a question to you here, because I think it's interesting to hear about when you talk with other foreign ministers, do they bring this issue up? The ethical dimensions we heard, education and all of this, is this a topic that they are debating when you meet them?
I think the answer to that is too seldom. I really believe that we ought to more often discuss this also at the Foreign Affairs Council and make those links and discuss the risks. And I agree with both of you, of course, about the risks. And we often compare with what we are willing to pay for the risk of having a flight accident, an airplane accident, and with a probability very low, but still we know that the impact is high, and therefore we are willing to do a lot to ensure sort of our security. But when it comes to this issue, we are still struggling to even get it on the Security Council's agenda. So we've been so far rather alone in trying to concretely put it on the agenda, and I think still my plan is that we can do it in a way that we show through the country reporting, the situation reporting, how it should be done, and get some good examples of that. So to use the UN agencies to report on the lack of drinking water or food scarcity or other sort of phenomena, and how they can drive conflict and the risks of conflict. But we are still only at the beginning of actually making it the whole way to the Security Council, firmly place it there. But I think we will soon get allies also in this work. And so many wise things have already been said about that. I really like your idea of putting up or complementing the IPCC with another panel, looking at also the psychological, and you just supported my thesis of needing the behavioral scientists as well to chip into this and help us in understanding what this does to the whole world. I think it creates a lot of angst. So I think anxiety, and people feel, oh yeah, where are we going? Is this inevitable? What can we do? So I think we have to provide a narrative that also gives some hope, because think of our children and grandchildren. What will their lives be like if it continues like this? And so I think we need that whole narrative. And I think there is an ethical aspect of it as well, and that is part of what we are saying. So we have to have a more holistic approach to this whole issue. And I've seen it also in the Caribbean and of course in the Pacific and the small island states. I can see what this does to the whole livelihood, but also the idea of who we are and what the future brings.
Thank you so much. And I'll give the panel here a chance to respond, because both of you are dealing with research and actually are in institutions that deal with information. So how do we educate about this? Would be interesting to hear your views.
I think that this is an issue on which there is constant movement and change, and it's more or less looked at in broad over the past 32, 33 years since Jim Hansen first got coverage for the global warming thesis at the time. I think there's been times when it seems like there's a bit of pushback and things begin to move in a different direction. But in general, if you look across those 3 decades, there's been a steady march forward of knowledge and of understanding. And part of what that has involved, Johan will know much better than I do how this has unfolded in the natural science field. But what I see as an outsider in that, and what I also see in the social science field, is that as there is a kind of intuitive feeling that the answers that are coming up are not quite satisfying enough, then different methodologies are put forward, different theories get advanced, a different approach comes through. And as I said very briefly, I think that some of the answers that the scholarly community has been producing about causation of conflicts have been misleading answers because the question was wrongly designed in the beginning. And as the question is more appropriately designed to not does climate change cause conflict, but is climate change a part of the explanation along with other factors of why these risks occur, then we're going to actually, with a more kind of muddled question in a sense, or a more complex question, we're going to get clearer answers, which is a paradox perhaps, but I think is what is happening. I just briefly comment on the ethical dimension. I mean, what this goes to is the question of social justice. And it goes also to the question of social justice between a rich north that has produced most of the carbon emissions and a poorer global south that will pay most of the price for that. And I think that ethical dimension has to be included in the discussions. And there have been attempts to do that in the lead up to Paris and so on. And I think because the ethical argument moved forward, that was one of the reasons why the Paris Climate Agreement was possible, because it was no longer seen as being something where, oh, the North has realized its mistake and now it's trying to get everybody to pay the price. There was rather a sense of this, I forget the exact term, as differentiated and specific responsibilities that emitters had. I think that argument can still go further, but I do think that social justice is at the heart of the issue of climate change and more broadly of environmental sustainability. And if we ignore it, then we ignore it at our peril.
No, and I fully agree we need a new narrative. I would say there are some efforts being done on advancing a new narrative. I would even go as far to say as we're sitting on the best untold story in town. You know, we have the scientific evidence today that we are putting our future generations at risk because we can actually destabilize the whole planet. But we have the solutions to transform ourselves to a world that is not about environmental protection. It is about health, security, and prosperity for humanity in World 2.0. It's a more advanced, more technologically savvy, much more exciting, and much more socially and justice and democratically apt planet where we can use all our intelligence, and of course it will require an ethical revolution as well. But I think we're so bad at connecting the diagnostic with the opportunities and to do it in a credible way. Nobody has, as far as I know, painted up how Stockholm will look like in 13 years when it will be totally fossil fuel free. You know, you cannot really imagine yet what we're in for, but we're in for a revolution, and it's around the corner. When it comes to science, I just want to, it seems like perhaps I wasn't absolutely clear. The science is unequivocal. Humans have caused global warming. We are at 1.1 Celsius warming, degrees Celsius. It's the warmest point since the last ice age, for 20,000 years back. It was when we left the last ice age that we were able to evolve civilization as we know it. We know with very high degree of certainty that if we push ourselves to 2 degrees Celsius, we are passing a point where we very likely are going from a manageable situation to an unmanageable situation. That's why 2 degrees Celsius has so strong scientific support. That's why the scientific community supports the Paris Agreement. But the science is unequivocal. What is the challenge, as Dan and I have been trying to point out, is this complex interdisciplinary landscape of the connections between climate change and conflict. And I think that is something that we'd like to explore further. And let me just say one word on ethics. You know, Margot said something so important. Kiribati is considering evacuation. Can you imagine if Sweden was considering evacuation? Can you imagine the social uprising in this country if we were actually at a point where the world community had caused a situation where the nation state Sweden is at risk of disappearing? You know, this is an ethical fundament where we need to respect each other so deeply. It really touches, I think, all our hearts.
So, yeah.
Done.
I just wanted to grab the microphone back to say explicitly something which I've only indicated by nodding, which is that I think that this idea of the parallel panel, which you brought up, Johan, I think that's really good. I mean, I would completely support that. Some kind of effort that really solidifies a consensus basis of what questions to ask and what the answers that are coming out, and puts some real weight and kind of intellectual and institutional muscle behind that. That would be great. And as I say, I've only nodded wisely so far. I just wanted to say it.
Can the SRC bring forward a proposal to Margot?
Why not?
Well, actually, that's one great outcome. Thank you so much, all of you. I think we have to conclude now. I know that our foreign minister will also have to leave, and we're moving into the next phase of this seminar, which is a more in-depth expert level, where we are having a couple of researchers that will go through this even at further depth. So thank you to our panelists. I really appreciated this, and in a way we have now identified the problems. We have some answers to this that we need to promote. The risks are there, we are aware of them, and we need to mitigate them, both at the institutional level, the political level, and the scientific level. Thank you so much all for coming, and thanks especially to our foreign minister. So we actually, all of those who had questions and didn't have the opportunity to ask them, you're happy to stay here now for this more in-depth discussion, and you will have the opportunity to ask them later. And while some are leaving, I would like to invite Nina von Yxkull, who is assistant professor at the Department of Conflict Research at Uppsala University. You can please have a seat. I would also like to invite Maria Wink, who is the program manager at Stockholm International Water Institute. Welcome. And Helena Nordenstedt, assistant professor at Global Health at Karolinska Institutet. And finally, Amira Sawas, a researcher at CIPRI. Please, the panel, you can be seated. And the idea here is to do the same format. I'll ask each of the panelists to come up and make a short presentation. And then we will take questions from the audience and continue this debate. So please, Nina, can I ask you to come up and take the podium here?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Nina van Uxkull. I'm based at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research, and I'm also affiliated with the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And I have devoted my research in the past 7 years to exactly the questions that were raised here, to studying the linkages between climate change, food security, and armed conflict. And when I mean conflict here, I'm meaning large-scale violence. In Uppsala, we have a database collecting information on communal violence in the past 25 years. We have data on the occurrence of civil war, and this data, together with satellite data on crop production, for example, together with weather statistics, has advanced the study on this question, on the average impact of drought and other climate-related disasters on armed conflict a lot. And I'm happy to give you some of the overview of what we have found so far. Is there anything beyond the anecdotes that have been mentioned that we also can find in terms of an average effect of climate variability and climate change? So let me start by saying today we know that there seems to be some consensus that climate change and resource scarcity per se is not a good predictor of conflict, meaning that we should not overstate the role of climate variability and resource scarcity. And the way I mean it is that if you look around the world, we have a number of situations where we have climatic disasters, where we have a situation of scarcity, and very rarely this leads to violence. And this makes sense if you look at the individual level. So we already touched upon this a bit. So at the individual level, there are many more options available usually to adapt to these kinds of situations. So researchers in this field see like climate variability as such, if you look at globally, as not as a good predictor of violence. That said, I think there's growing evidence that under circumstances where there's already fertile ground for violence, it can be a contributing factor. So more research is needed, but key factors that repeatedly show up is that there is a history of violence, that there's already ongoing violence, that, for example, ethnic groups are excluded from political power. So there's already a fertile ground where you have organizations using violence, where you have groups that may tap into to the grievances arising, to the economic situations that are arising from, for example, shocks to agriculture production. So, and another factor that I should mention is that we find these linkages in regions where agriculture is particularly important. So while agriculture in this country is not a large economic sector, in Mali, a case that has been mentioned, we have 40% working in agriculture in 2005, for example. So when you have a drought in these circumstances, it has major impacts on the livelihood and the income of the rural populations. What does this mean for the future? So I said that we do not see climate variability at present as a major cause of violence. However, we are only seeing the beginning of the impact of climate change. So, and especially in the countries that already are affected by violence, adaptation to these circumstances will be very, very difficult. So in scenarios of 2 degrees or 4 degrees plus, we find quite an amazing consensus among researchers that this could be indeed leading to substantial conflict risks in the future. So although it might not be a huge problem today, if we look into the future, it could be these impacts could be much stronger. What does this mean for policy? First of all, mitigating climate change is, of course, something that is truly important. Scenarios of 4 degrees plus are truly alarming. But we also need more evidence. We need more evidence under what circumstances climate variability and change do indeed impact conflict risks. We are only at the beginning of identifying the context under which, like, these shocks to rural income and agriculture production do constitute a security risk. For example, looking into the institutions are very important. But also more research in how the links can be broken, how resilience can be built in countries that are already affected by conflict, where we most likely will see that climate-related disasters further add onto existing security risks are very important. And one ongoing research project that I want to mention here is a collaboration with the FAO. They are doing work on resilience in the DRC. Eastern DRC is a very unstable context. And in collaboration with us, we're looking into the effect of these programs building resilience on local land conflict and attitudes to violence. And lastly, I want to emphasize that addressing conflict itself is a major tool for preventing adverse effects of climate change. If you look at the countries with a severe food crisis today, like South Sudan, Yemen, northern Nigeria, Somalia, these are all examples of countries that are devastated by conflict. So the food crisis we see there clearly has roots in the conflict. And it's also clear that in this situation, the capacity to adapt to climate change is extremely low. So we both have challenges from existing conflict. We have low capacity to adapt to climate change. And so these are situations where we really may see that additional strains from climate change, additional adverse impacts on food security may be something that further increases instability. So these are the situations where climate change will have particularly high tolls. So everything addressing the local conflicts maybe is something that is important to further increase the adaptive capacity of these societies and to limit human suffering in the future and today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there will be questions to you afterwards. I would like to ask our next panelist to come up. Please, Maria Wink, if you can take the podium here.
Yes, hello everybody. I have a bit of a cold, so I hope my voice will carry me through this. I will talk about the link on water, climate change and security, and we heard quite a bit about that already. Minister Wallström was mentioning that it started with water and ended with water. I'm not as pessimistic as that, but I'll explain a bit further. But clearly, global warming, combined with growing populations and economies, it increases the pressure on available resources, and the freshwater resources available per capita is decreasing all the time. And water scarcity, it already affects 40% of the global population, and that number will clearly go up. Already, several major rivers, such as the Nile, the Indus, the Jordan, and Euphrates and Tigris, the withdrawal nearly equals or exceeds the recharge in those rivers. and 1.7 billion people are living in such rivers where water use exceeds recharge. The water is, as we know, essential for life, for drinking, for growing food, for energy production, manufacturing industries, and conservation of nature and wildlife. Water stress and water shortages is really a direct threat to human security, and that has been mentioned here several times today. Water insecurity is also contributing to migration from rural areas to cities, from cities to other countries, and also contributing to social unrest. So continued global warming will also speed up the melting of the polar and alpine glaciers that contain the bulk of our global freshwater. In South Asia, the glacial melt from the Himalayas comprises a substantial part of major rivers such as Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra. And when this glacier runoff recedes, it will have a huge impact on the populations in this densely populated area. And we see already disagreements in this area, especially over construction of large dams that will impact the water flows. Complicating matters further, most of the world's freshwater resources are shared between 2 or more countries. Globally, around 286 such rivers exist that are shared between countries, and approximately 40% of the global population live in river basins that are transboundary. So, with this situation of water scarcity and countries sharing rivers, why don't we see so many water conflicts, or do we? Oregon State University have looked at statistics of water events, cooperation, and conflicts over a large time, and they come to the conclusion that cooperation over shared waters is much more common than conflict. But there are, of course, reasons to think that climate change could change this with increased water stress and uncertainties. A study of African nations determined that where drought occurred and GDP subsequently declined with more than 5% per year, the likelihood that the country would fall into civil war increased by more than half. So there is also statistics on that link. But one explanation of why countries don't enter into war over shared water resources is, of course, that they are dependent on each other. Water connects the countries. But another, maybe dominating explanation is the imbalance of power between countries. We often hear in the water community the term hydrohegemony. And such, in looking at the Nile Basin, the Mekong Basin, and so on, we have Egypt in the Nile, we have China in the Mekong, that are often referred to as hegemonies. And those states, they can assert power over less powerful states to enter into agreements. So sometimes what looks like cooperation is rather coercive interactions. But also the perceptions of injustice, both between countries, between communities, and the perception of increasing risk itself can cause more conflict between countries. So, studies on transboundary water resources have identified 2 key variables that define the likelihood and intensity of water and conflict in a given river basin. So those variables, it's the rate of physical or institutional change in a water system. So both physical and institutional change. But the second is the strength of the cooperative institutions linking riparian countries or countries sharing the same river. Hence, very rapid changes that cannot be managed by existing institutional capacity are the root of most water conflicts. And global warming will clearly be a factor increasing such risk by contributing to this physical change. on one measure that to both adapt and mitigate to climate change is to build dams, often large-scale dams to produce hydropower, which is a non-fossil fuel. We need more energy production, the energy demand is decreasing. But those dams, they also regulate flows. So with increasing variability, a dam can actually be a way of adapting. But the large dams then, it's really a very rapid physical change. So we see commonly conflict over large dam constructions. Looking at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam right now, we see the tensing relations between Egypt and Ethiopia over the construction of that dam. And also in South Asia, there are many large dams being constructed, causing tension. So the solutions then to strengthen the capacity of cooperative institutions, how do we do that? One important aspect is to have cooperative arrangements, such as transboundary agreements between countries or local agreements on the sharing and management of water resources. Currently, there are around 286 transboundary rivers. 2/3 of them lack agreements, cooperation agreements. And this is clearly not a good situation. And for those who have agreements in place, almost none of them mention climate change. A good thing that increases the possibility to agree on principles for water cooperation is that the UN Water Convention on the non-navigational uses of international water courses, as it's called. It has a long and complicated name, but this is the UN Convention on Transboundary Waters. It entered into force 2014, after a very long time since it was drafted in 1997. And this convention, it includes very important aspects of transboundary cooperation. It includes principles such as the equitable and reasonable utilization of water resources. This is clearly a way of addressing the injustice that was mentioned, I think, by Dan Smith. It also includes a principle called to not cause significant harm on another country. And it also includes a consultation and peaceful dispute resolution clause. So here we have a tool that can actually help us. But at present, about 1/5 of transboundary river basins in Africa, Asia, and South America have agreements that include those basic principles. So only 1/5, it's quite low. Another way of promoting strengthening institutions is the creation of river basin organizations. So to have organizations that provide dialogue platforms and also provide knowledge. So these are issues that we can do. We can continue to strengthen these institutions. But we also need to develop more holistic approaches. Okay, I see. Policymakers must look at both technical and policy issues, and that is often not the case. I just want, before I finish up, mention another aspect, inclusiveness. We had principles of integrated water resources management for a very long time, and those principles have not usually been implemented very strongly, especially not in transboundary context. And here I think we have a key for more sustainable agreements. Water cooperation agreements cannot only be negotiated at state level. You have to include grassroots, civil society, private sector, but not the least media. Media has a huge impact in talking about the perceptions and perceptions of cooperation, what is unjust and what is just. So we shouldn't forget media. And at CB, we have very good experiences of working with different kind of stakeholders, not the least media, and we've seen really good results from that. So it's something that actually works. And I also want to mention water is often an entry point for dialogue in areas of historical conflict. So sometimes when you cannot agree on anything, climate change and water can be an entry point for dialogue and be seen as a confidence-building measure. So there's also another opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. We have two more panelists, and then we will have a discussion. Next is Helena Nordenstedt, and this is about health, climate and security.
So we have heard a lot today about the connection between climate change and security, but I have lacked the perspective of health. I haven't even heard health being mentioned, maybe once, but not more than that. And I would like to bring health back onto the board and into the discussion. And I wonder why it is that we forget about health. And is it because here in this part of the world where we are right now, we have the luxury to not think about health? Because we don't have to think about health every day, the health of ourselves or the health of our loved ones. And we can forget about it, for at least until someone is affected. But I would like to bring it back into the discussion. And when I was asked if I could give a presentation without a PowerPoint, I asked, can I get a whiteboard? And I did get a whiteboard. So we have climate change, security, and we have health. So this is a very basic model. It's nothing very complicated to remember. But how is health affected by climate change? And we have quite a few examples. I will just mention a few. We already know that climate change, warmer temperatures, can affect vector-borne diseases like diseases that are spread by mosquitoes. The yellow fever mosquito that can spread dengue and the Zika virus will spread into new areas as temperatures increase. In Sweden, we have the example of the tick, which used to only be found along the eastern coast of Sweden, but can now be found in actually almost half of Sweden, far up north, where it was never seen before. We also have extreme weather events like floods and droughts that can bring us diseases like cholera. We have somewhat more surprising effects, floods that can bring up landmines, as was the case in 2014 in Bosnia. And now in September, again, it was reported that landmines from Yemen was coming up in floods at the border of Saudi Arabia. We also have the effect of climate change on displacing populations, which we already talked about, but we did not talk about the effect on health. So when populations are displaced and people might end up in refugee camps, health services are disrupted. People are cramped into small camps. We have risks of TB. But what we do see, something that maybe is a bit counterintuitive, is that in quite a few refugee camps, the health is better on the inside than on the outside, because on the inside there is access to some health services, in some parts of the world at least. However, that is one way of how climate change can affect health. But health can also affect climate change, maybe a little bit more, not as direct. But in countries where health is good, that's where we can also afford the luxury to think about climate change, to care more about climate change, to advocate more for the importance of taking measures against climate change. And also, as was noted in the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change, what is good for climate change to counter climate change is also good for public health. So many of the measures have good effects on both. I'll do this. What about health and security then? How can health affect security? So, in recent years, it has become quite evident that there are threats, global health threats that know no boundaries, like antimicrobial resistance, but also infectious disease outbreaks that can become pandemics. It was very clearly seen in the Ebola outbreak in 2014-15 in West Africa, where it was declared by the UN not only to be a public health threat, but also a threat to peace and security by the UN Security Council. And why was this? Because the Ebola outbreak, you maybe remember what it was like in September, October 2014, but it caused a lot of fear, not only in the 3 most affected countries, but all over the world. And by doing so, the fear can cause panic, and the panic can then cause political instability. Actually, the US sent 3,000 soldiers to Liberia to make sure that stability was kept. And in this context, John Kerry noted that instability anywhere can be a threat to stability everywhere, also in the case of Ebola in West Africa. So we have... Finally, how can security affect health in the other direction? Quite maybe the most intuitive example would be what happens in a country when there is a war or a conflict. The health system is affected. Vaccination programs can be disrupted. As seen in Syria, a country that has been free of polio for 20 years, polio has now erupted again. Other examples is if we take a look at the fantastic progress we have made in halving extreme poverty, the share of people living in extreme poverty in the past 25 years. People living in extreme poverty are also the same people where the health tends to be the worst. But, yes, I'm a teacher normally, that's why I do this. We take a look at the share of people living in extreme poverty. Going down, we are now down to 10% of the world population. But if we take a look at the share of people living in extreme poverty in fragile states, it has been more or less unchanged. So we have this fantastic progress in fighting extreme poverty and the fantastic progress that has come with it also in health. But in fragile states, not much has happened. So if we want to reach the goal number 1 of the SDG agenda of continuing to fight extreme poverty, we need to address the health situation in the fragile states and the poverty situation. So finally, what I would like to add is also how health affects security. And maybe that is sometimes a bit overlooked, but good health, a government that provides its population with access to basic health care will earn the trust of the population. And if you have the trust of the population, you will have a more stable society. So, and one example of this is Nepal, where providing basic health care to the population after the civil war was seen as one of the keys to peace building. So who are most affected by these 3 entities? As always, it's the vulnerable groups. It's those living in extreme poverty. It's women, and it's children, and it's migrants. So we have already heard about water and food, but we will also now hear more about women. And before ending, I would like to say a few words about, I actually come from Karolinska Institute, but I represent here today the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformation, SITE, which is a new institute. And if you want to know more, you can go to the website where there is a brochure. This is the last one. You can also have mine. And SITE is working on several of these issues. We are working on, we're contributing to the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change. We are working on the SDG interlinkages and to see how they affect child health. And finally, we have been invited by the Lancet to contribute to a commission, a Lancet commission where we look at SDG 3, health, SDG 5, with women's empowerment and gender equality, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and security. So that is what we do. This is what we do. Don't forget health. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we come to our last panelist, Amira Sawas, and as noted, we have to bring in the gender dimension into this as well. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to start with saying that I can't agree with my colleague enough on health and security. I myself have suffered from waterborne diseases, one which is still plaguing me a couple of years later. And I think my husband can attest to the fact that his security has suffered as a result. But on a more serious note, I'm the child of migrants, the daughter of Syrian refugees, niece, cousin. And this, I can't agree enough as well with the urgency of this topic. So I'm really glad that we're here, and I feel very humbled to be here with the development and the security stakeholders, because I feel that this is a really positive step forward. So I'm going to talk about the nexus between climate change, gender, and security. And this is of increasing relevance to policymakers and practitioners of development and security. But for people living in developing and conflict-affected states, they live and observe these overlapping spheres every single day of their lives now. It's no surprise to them that these issues are affecting their lives. But for analysts, policymakers, and practitioners, understanding how these three separate phenomena connect and mediate each other is a very daunting task, for the reasons that have been outlined time and time again today. I've been working in the Global South, doing research on these issues for some time, and I've also recently conducted a review of evidence on the linkages between gender, climate change, and security, pulling from a very broad range of studies. And I think we can all agree that gender has become a central concept in development and security. We have gender mainstreaming, we have Resolution 1325 in the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, we have the establishment of actors like UN Women and gender-focused donors like FRIDA, and we have SDG Goal 5. We've come a really, really long way, and all efforts should be applauded. Sweden in particular has played a really vital role in these positive steps, so I feel extremely privileged to be in this room today with esteemed colleagues. However, now is the time to take this excellent movement forward. And what do I mean by that? Fundamentally, gender is more than just women. Gender is a socially constructed phenomena. Societies construct norms around gender, which include expectations, roles, and responsibilities ascribed to women, men, girls, and boys. This includes their relationships with each other. And this is really important to this discussion, because through all my work, I've observed that the most vulnerable people to the intersections of climate change and security are not necessarily just women. It's women from marginalized groups in some contexts. In other contexts, it's young males, the most understudied survivors of gender violence, for example. In other contexts, in fact, across the realm, most contexts, you find that it's people who fall out of gender norms according to their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. So the gender, climate change, and security nexus affects people in different ways. It affects their human security, and it is also related to how they may become incentivized to or mobilized towards violence and conflict. So in terms of the review, there are 4 key areas of evidence that, as we were talking about earlier, you can't be completely decisive, but there's enough evidence to suggest that these links are there. The first one, you'll not be surprised to hear, is livelihood security. So this is when the nexus really inflames. And that's because climate change impacts people in gendered ways. What do I mean by this? Well, I'm sure we've all heard that women are 14 times more likely to die in a climate-related disaster. Well, this is because the way that we live our lives is fundamentally gendered, and this includes our mobilities and our access to rights and services. But gender alone is not sufficient to determine one's vulnerability. For example, in Hurricane Katrina, it was black working-class women who were the predominant survivors and victims of the hurricane, Other women had the resources and mobilities to get out in time. And this is to do with the structural history of racial discrimination and urbanization in that particular place. Let me give you another example. In the severe heat waves in Pakistan last year, where I do a lot of work, it was actually poor elderly men that died due to the heat wave and the urban heat island effect, over 1,000. And this was because they were more likely to be working outside in the heat, whereas due to women's mobilities, they were more likely to be inside. There's been a huge emphasis on the Syrian civil war and the crisis in the Lake Chad Basin. Let me tell you that when I look into the grounded realities and when you speak to practitioners on the ground, it becomes very clear that these crises were predicated by the combination and intersections of livelihood insecurity, environmental change, and masculinities. So in Lake Chad, as many of you must be aware, the basin has shrunk around 90% since 1963, in an area where about 80% of people rely on pastoral livelihoods and crop production. This has naturally devastated local livelihoods and food security. And what men on the ground say is that they suffer a curse of masculinity because they're the ones who are expected to be the breadwinners. They're the ones who are expected to own property, to become married in the suitable way. And all of these kind of social categories and abilities to climb up the social ladder are related to each other. And of course, it depends on the specific region of the Lake Chad Basin. At the same time as a building crisis over livelihoods happened, Boko Haram emerged in the early 2000s. Fundamentally, this was due to a disagreement about Western influence over Islam and gendered norms in the region. And Boko Haram's tactics have been highly gendered. Some of the main things that they've been doing is kidnapping officials' wives, kidnapping the Chibok girls, and the government's responses have been highly gendered as well. And this crisis of masculinities made the ideology of Boko Haram and its benefits more attractive. And I see this in my work on the ground all the time. The inability, though, of governments and international actors to understand the gender aspect, to understand this crisis from a gendered lens, has further exacerbated, in my opinion, and according to the evidence, the conflicts. They failed to promote alternative livelihoods. They shut down fishing for 3 years because of concerns about Boko Haram hiding within fishing areas. But what this did was this further devastated livelihoods and masculinities and created further reason for young men to join Boko Haram. And there's been support for an armed resistance as well against Boko Haram, which has engaged masculinities even further. But according to International Crisis Group's latest report, this has actually accelerated the conflict. A second area of evidence is in migration and displacement that we've talked about quite a lot. Again, this is not really a surprise to any of us, but the decisions about whether to migrate, options of how to migrate, and the security implications of migration are highly, highly gendered. And I don't have the time to go into detail today, but let us just reflect for a moment on the horrifying situation of enslavement in Libya. There's much more research to be done, but preliminary findings by Oxfam have found that the majority of those enslaved were West African migrants escaping intersecting livelihood crises and conflicts. A very high number of women and men experience sexual violence and torture, so it's not just women that are experiencing these things. And the majority of survivors being sold as slaves were young, able-bodied males. New research on those displaced from Syria and Lebanon highlights that the most vulnerable populations are those marginalised by their sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, because there aren't services for them, because they're not seen as being within the realm of the norm, obviously within that context. And a third area where the gender, climate change and security nexus tends to inflame is to do with infrastructure and basic services. Key infrastructure is under threat from climate change in much of the global south. I think we can all agree on that. And urban security in particular is under threat from climate change. But this must be understood through a gender lens. I've witnessed in my own research in cities of Pakistan that different forms of gender violence emerge in relation to climate impacts. This ranges from a surge in domestic violence, not from men to women necessarily, but between men and women, between women and women, between men and men, in response to unexpected floods that people did not have early warning systems or social protection for. There's also a violent masculine political economy of water in the megacity of Karachi. Then there are options of joining criminal networks as a last resort when minority fishing livelihoods have been destroyed. Climate change is a key part of the story, but the reasons for the violence and conflict emerge in these places is to do with the intersection of existing material and gendered insecurities. Climate change comes in, makes it worse, and obviously masculinities is a key lens to understand that. And the final area in which we should seriously think about is climate change responses. This is a woefully underexplored area, and I'm glad that Dan spoke to it to an extent earlier. We need to think about how responses to climate change lead to gendered security issues. For example, in another ongoing project of mine in Pakistan, myself and colleagues are exploring how a range of mega projects for mitigation across the country are affecting local people's lives. Adaptation and mitigation need to happen fast, and this is having major implications for economies and societies. What happens when a project displaces thousands of people or dispossesses already marginalised groups? What about when projects intervene in local cultures or affect gender norms? We're seeing security implications emerging, but we're also seeing interesting responses from the different organisations involved to counter these security risks and create opportunities for locally appropriate responses to climate change. There's much more research to be done, however. So in conclusion, considering these 4 areas of evidence, what does this mean for policymakers and practitioners? The first point is we have to move on from gender as just women. We have to move on from presumptions that masculinities mean aggression and that femininities are environmentally friendly and, fundamentally peace-building. Localizing the analysis is absolutely critical, as gender norms around masculinities and femininities are specific to context and differ within regions. And there are hierarchies of power and privilege within gender groups, which we really need to pay attention to if we want to understand what incentivizes someone to conflict, what drives vulnerabilities of specific groups. So crucially, gendered violence and vulnerability is to do with the intersection of gender with other axes of marginalization. So that might be race, class, religious affiliation, political affiliation, sexual orientation, I can go on. We need to start developing tools to make this possible. And it's always a messy process when you're trying to do interdisciplinary work, and I've been trying to do that for some time working with scientists myself. But we need to start, we need to pilot tools, we need to see what works, and most importantly, we need to do them in participation with the people living in the regions in which we want to understand. So I strongly encourage that. At CIPRI, we're really open to collaboration. It's something we want to encourage more and more within this community. And I just want to say thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So thank you all very much. I really believe we got a very broad plate of issues here. And I think in our earlier panel we heard about the necessity to actually interchange between different disciplines and not only focus on one particular thing, natural science or whatever. Now I think you all showed that there are interlinkages between all these issues. Now we have about 10 minutes before we need to close, and I'm very happy to take questions from the floor to the panelists. My own perspective when I heard you all speak is that there was some kind of positive element of all of your interventions. Addressing conflict and dealing with conflict resolution actually also helps climate change, so it goes the other way around. That was what I took from the first. Second, there is a lot of cooperation on water. It's strange that there are no more water wars. And if those institutions are strengthened, maybe we can cope with even strained relations when it comes to water. So that is something that I took for very hopeful. On health, we need to bring health issues in, and you made the picture here of the interlinkages, and of course with with this link here and what we have discussed today with climate and security, I think there is an indirect connection to the climate and security agenda that we need to address. And finally, gender issues, the more sophisticated analysis that you brought forward and actually looking locally what matters. And Isabella Levine mentioned her experience from Mali. We were there, I joined her there for a couple of days, and there you could see all those elements really in play when it comes to going into criminal activity and the strains of societies when the water of the Niger is receding. So, sophisticated presentation. Now I need some sophisticated questions from the audience. Anyone up for a question here? Yes, please go ahead. You can use this microphone here.
Hi, I'm a student at Uppsala University in human geography and currently interested in water diplomacy. So I have a question to Ms. Maria Wink. It's about translating science about hydrochemistry to people who already see the water as holy and clean, because this is also, from a linguistical point of view, a very challenging communication, because when we, from a scientific approach, say that this water is dangerous for you, and then you have another scientific approach thinking, well, this water is already holy because of their religions or traditions or cultures. How can we communicate and integrate the scientific approach and the more traditional, depending on where we are, of course, but this language barriers? Yeah. Oh, du måste kanske ha den för så.
It's on, okay. Thank you very much for raising this important issue. Really, water is an aspect in many religions, I would probably say all. Very important, also carrying culture linked to the procedures that you were describing. And when I talked about inclusiveness, I think that the religious communities, the religious leaders are really key in many aspects in providing messages, and I think we have to work with them to make them understand those issues. And actually, at CB, we are looking right now into the possibility of establishing a faith-based network group that will work with water and faith, and this could be one entry point to have those dialogues and spread these messages and make people understand better those messages. But it is not a quick, easy process. It will take time and to change such perceptions, but I think, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hey, I'm Shilpa and I'm a researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. Thanks everyone for the wonderful talks, and it was very informative. My question is again to Maria. It's regarding the transboundary conflicts. So what is your opinion on the role of foreign players, the players other than the riparian countries, when it comes to transboundary water conflicts?
That's a highly interesting question, and I'll just add to brought up the example of the Nile in Ethiopia and Egypt. But my understanding of the situation is that the main users of the water resources, if it will be regulated, will be in Sudan, where the Gulf countries are investing heavily for food security reasons. So exactly, you have external actors that really come into play using the water for their own security purposes.
Thank you. Yes, that's a really complex and big issue. I mean, we of course have the support, the development cooperation support from agencies that do have a huge impact, both in the Nile and the Mekong, for example, where donors to the Nile has since around 2002 contributed with more than $200 million to that cooperation. And that has an impact, of course, building institutions and so on. But my aspect is that there's a missing link between foreign affairs and development cooperation and security. There has to be a more holistic view so that this assessment of the impact on security actually done early and continuously in such interventions. But then, of course, we have the new players, both China as a big investor, the Gulf states, as you mentioned in Sudan. That changes things very, very much. And here I think those cooperative agreements within the basin states is really important. So also in the context of managing other foreign players in the region. Yeah, I'll stop there. I could speak for a very long time.
Yes, we have a question here. I think we'll take this question, and there was one more question there, because we then need to wrap up. So those are the two final questions.
Thank you. My question is for Amira. My name is Katie. I'm from Operation 1325, civil society organization here. I liked hearing about your experiences of firsthand responses to, now my brain is dying because it's the end of the day, when climate change has adverse effects and the responses are overlooking a gendered perspective. Has your experience been that now this is something that is being considered, or is it continually being overlooked? And if it is something that's still being overlooked, how can we force this on the agenda, so to speak? Thank you.
Thank you. The last question. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a question for the first speaker who gave a very interesting talk. You mentioned that, and I would wholeheartedly agree, that climate change isn't necessarily the sole driver of conflict, and in many cases doesn't have a direct effect that leads to conflict. But I was wondering how much that might be dependent on the characteristics of the resource that you're looking at, because I, for example, work with fisheries and fish wars specifically. And there, of course, the resource is very different from freshwater and is also arguably maybe more affected by climate change in terms of its distribution and abundance for the next decades, where it will be swimming all over the place into new regions, and countries might get into conflict because of that, and we're already seeing that. So do you think that climate change's effect is different for different resources? And also, what would you suggest in terms of mitigation strategies? Can they be similar for different resources, or would you recommend different approaches for different resources?
Thank you. Two excellent questions. Let's give first to Amira.
Hi, I'll try not to give a very long answer, which I certainly could. No, gender is definitely not being considered sufficiently. In so many development and adaptation and mitigation projects, gender is a tag-on. Let's get the women involved. Let's have a women's focus group, for example. This doesn't take into account power dynamics within women, let alone power dynamics between women and men and other marginalized groups. What has been really interesting from what I have seen, though, particularly with these mega projects which are happening in Pakistan, is that initially there was a very, you can say, limited process of consultation, which caused many grievances, especially around gender roles within the particular area. The company who was involved in implementation realized at a certain point that this was really going to affect the sustainability of their business model. So they hired an activist from the region as their head of corporate social responsibility. And he hired another 15 people from that region. And the first thing that they did was they changed their approach to gender. So they found locally appropriate ways to increase women's access to employment in a region where women's access to employment was extremely limited. And this is starting to have some very, very interesting impacts, but they took a very, very culturally appropriate approach, and that is absolutely what is needed. And the problem is, and I've last year done a review with various actors involved in these kind of renewables and adaptation and mitigation projects. Many of them are consultancies or companies in the global north, and their response was, we really want to do things right, but we just don't know the context. We go in with the permission of the government or the developers, and we really don't have access to the stakeholders. We just have to rely on the limited information that we have. So what we really need to do is start developing these kind of evidence bases. And one thing that I was really encouraging is that we develop networks of local expertise, so that when a company or an organization is going to start doing the process of an environmental and social impact assessment, they have access to the right people who can really get a sense of what the needs are in that area.
Thank you very much. And last response is Nina.
Thank you so much for your question. This is, of course, very relevant. So I have been looking into communal in civil war, and here agriculture as such is particularly important. I think that in theory, fisheries could also be a resource that that could be in the future lead to these kind of conflict when it leads to kind of economic shocks in situations that are already fragile, where you have armed organizations. So my point is more that if you look at disasters and if you look at climate variability, at this moment, this is nothing that will tell you, looking at the weather will not tell you where the conflicts break out. It will looking at the political institutions, looking at existing instabilities will tell you where instabilities will be tomorrow. So in terms of mitigation strategy, this is kind of classic conflict resolution, this is classic conflict prevention, but also with an eye on the management of the resources. So can we not only not do harm when doing interventions, but can we do good? Can we, in situations that are very fragile, can we improve existing intervention in a way that they contribute to unite communities rather than divide it? Can we strengthen the resilience of populations that live in contexts where you have militias, where you have ongoing conflict, in a way that contributes to sustainable peace? I think these are very important.
Thank you all very much. I really would like to give a warm hand to our panelists before we wrap up. And once again, I would like to thank CIPRI and Stockholm Resilience Center for co-hosting this with us. There is a very good booklet here in the corner that it's a project that CIPRI did with funding from us, and I think it's a really good read if you want to get a summary of what we have been discussing now. And as you heard from our foreign minister, we want to really get active here in the Security Council. We want to achieve something before we end, and so we have about a year ahead of us, and we are going to go ahead full steam with this. Thanks a lot for coming, all of you.